Why is Shinju Eida something that doesn't make sense? Or perhaps more accurately, what would happen if Eida were bitten by claw grime like some of the other shinobi? Yeah, I'm Nim without the E. Let's talk for a moment about this dark fate. But before that, I think after seeing a dark fate between Eida and even Himawari appearing in the same panel, honestly, this really doesn't make any sense. Yeah, you know, those two characters obviously have plot armor that's extremely crucial, especially considering how important their roles are. So what makes Ikemoto want to create a scenario like that? And we have to admit that even if it really doesn't make any sense, and there are several examples that we also think are illogical, like Boruto being done for, no doubt, when fighting Jura, this case could also be an exception, meaning regardless of what the final outcome of that dark future will be, try to imagine a few things that should definitely be taken into consideration. First, let's start with Himawari. As we know, besides the fact that a monster like Kurama was born inside Himawari's body, Kurama himself stated that Himawari's chakra has a very strong, even special affinity. Or more precisely, she has a significant difference that truly surpasses all her predecessors, including her own father. So just like I said earlier, I'm sure it's not just me. All of us agree that the fate Kashin Koji saw about Himawari's death is something that doesn't make sense. Especially with the facts about her role and the amount of plot armor she has, it's hard to accept. Next is Eida. As a cyborg with godlike abilities that can manipulate reality, I think we can all agree that Eida's role would have a huge impact if she were to end up dead. But what makes it absurd is that with several crucial roles that could certainly become a much bigger problem if she became a Shinju or even died, it's certainly difficult to imagine how an Eida, who has plot armor like Damon or even Kashin Koji, would end tragically. At this point, we cannot completely underestimate Damon. But we also have to accept the fact that Mamushi's abilities are far beyond what we imagine. In other words, even though Damon has a reflection ability, can it be applied to many things at the same time? What I mean is, if there are 10 or more Mamushis at the same location with malicious intent, like biting, killing, or even injuring Eida, can Damon reflect all of that intent? I know this might sound ridiculous, but who knows if, in the end, there will be a moment that leads to such a reality. And once again, regardless of how Shikamaru's scenario to protect Eida and of course Boruto's help, if the number of Mamushi is beyond Konoha's ability to handle and the Mamushi end up splitting themselves and finding Eida, then the Daemon is the last guardian who will protect Eida. But like I said earlier, is it possible that Damon actually has limits when it comes to the number of enemies whose intent or attacks he can reflect? Yeah, just like we discussed before about Shibai's abilities being inherited through DNA transplantation, which gave them Shibai's powers, I'm very sure that even a godly ability, when inherited by a cyborg who isn't originally from the god or Otsutsuki race, must have weaknesses or limitations that are completely different from when it's used by an Otsutsuki themselves. In other words, maybe one of Damon's weaknesses is that he cannot reflect intent or attacks if they come from too many enemies at the same time, especially when the enemy is a Shinju, who obviously isn't just an ordinary human, right? But let's say that out of these two dark futures, only Eida cannot be saved, and what would actually happen if Eida really ended up becoming a tree? In this case, there are at least a few points to answer this question. But disclaimer, as usual, this is just an analysis and theory. If you think it doesn't make sense, or you have a different perspective, let's discuss it. So yeah, first and foremost, will Eida become a Shinju or even die? Because in my opinion, only Jura or even the author himself can answer these two questions. I mean, there is an example that I think is quite interesting as a reference. At the beginning of the Two Blue Vortex chapter, there's a scene where a Junin tries to protect Sarada from a claw grime attack, but he is the one who ends up getting bitten and turning into a tree. However, in this case, that Junin should have ended up just like Sasuke, Matsuri, Ryu, or even Bug, right? But here, the Junin who got bitten and turned into a tree had no confirmation afterward about whether he became a Shinju or what exactly happened to him. Because so far, this mystery is something no one has been able to solve. Meaning, determining whether Eida would turn into a Shinju after being bitten by a claw grime, or simply die is still a huge question mark. However, I don't want to leave this hanging. In other words, we know that Eida is a cyborg created by Amado and not a pure human. In my opinion, the process of becoming a tree as a result of being bitten by claw grime will work because the target is human plus biological chakra. Meanwhile, Eida's body certainly consists of non-organic components and some Otsutsuki cells or DNA, like Shibai. So the conclusion is, after being bitten by a claw grime, Eida would only be trapped inside the tree and is most likely not going to become a Shinju. Instead, she would either truly die or completely disappear. Or one of three other possibilities. If Eida is bitten by claw grime, she won't turn into a tree like you see here. Instead, it will only reduce some of her physical strength. Perhaps more simply, it will only leave physical wounds. In other words, it might be the claw grime itself that experiences an odd reaction or even dies. The reason is that claw grime is an entity originating from blood code and claw marks that break the Ten Tails chakra. Eida has Otsutsuki cells implanted by Amado. In the lore, lower-level beings are usually not compatible with Otsutsuki energy. So that means the possibility of a claw grime biting Eida might actually end up killing the claw grime instead or something like that. But for this second case, this is purely just my imagination, guys, but what do you think? And lastly, I think the thing that would actually trap Eida inside the tree, just like what you see here, is the result of Mamushi's bite itself. And once again, being trapped doesn't necessarily mean she will become a Shinju. In this case, if we refer to what Kashin Koji said, that Himawari or even Eida died, then it is certain that Eida did not become a Shinju, but her soul was truly dead and gone. The reason is, if it was the Mamushi that bit Eida, then the Mamushi would have obtained all of her DNA information and such. In other words, if a claw grime bites a shinobi, then the chakra or energy would be transferred to a tree root and become a Togadama, which could then create a Shinju like Sasuke and others. In this case, the Mamushi devoured all of the information, both her abilities and biological data, meaning Eida would be completely left behind with nothing remaining. Yeah, you know what I mean? So in my opinion, this is probably the reason why Kashin Koji said that Eida died instead of becoming a tree. Because, once again, why am I so sure that Eida will really die instead of becoming a tree? The first reason is because Eida is not a human being who has pure chakra like a human being. Second, even though we cannot guess for sure who bit Eida until he ended up becoming a tree, at least the most reasonable answer is Mamushi himself. Besides the fact that Mamushi was targeting her, I think it's quite difficult to say that Mamushi would summon Sumeaka in the middle of his invasion of Konoha to look for Eida. Logically, Mamushi himself has the ability to split himself. So it is certain that what made Eida like the fate you see is the result of Mamushi himself, right? And lastly, the reason why Eida didn't become a Shinju is because Mamushi devoured all of Eida's DNA, energy, and such. By leaving nothing of Eida behind, it's certain that this is the reason why Kashin Koji said that Eida died, rather than becoming a tree. By the way, shout out to Dreezy. If you have any questions, theories, or anything else about Boruto, let me know in the comments, but please don't forget to use the hashtag AskNim. So yeah, in the end, all these analyses or theories are just based on a Boruto addict. But if you have more reasonable reasons or theories, let's chat in the comments. Thank you for watching. I'm Nim without the E. See you in the next video. Bye-bye. Dadabayo.